The Ides of March are come. Aye, Caesar, but not gone. This exchange comes from Shakespeare's tragedy of Julius Caesar, Act 3, Scene 1. It takes place between Caesar and a soothsayer. Earlier in the play, the soothsayer, who is supposed to be able to see into the future, had warned Caesar to beware the Ides of March. And in this follow-up exchange, Caesar is laughing at him for his pointless warning. The Ides of March, which just means March the 15th in the Roman calendar, have arrived, and Caesar is fine. The joke, though, is on Caesar, as within a few moments he will be stabbed to death. Now, this day, the Ides of March, is probably the day in ancient history that we know the most about. We even know the exact number of stab wounds that Caesar received, 23. We know this because there was an autopsy on his bloodied corpse. This is the first recorded autopsy in history, carried out by a chap called Antistius. Such is the detail of it that we know that of all the stab wounds he received, only one, the second one in his chest, would have been fatal. That's a super amount of detail for a murder that happened well over 2,000 years ago. I love Julius Caesar. I've probably read more about him than I've read about any other figure in history. I was, it won't surprise many of you to know, a seriously geeky teenager. And I devoured histories, novels, and any television or movies that I could about Caesar. It was, it's fair to say, a serious man crush. I owe him a lot. I do think that part of the reason that I got into university was because I had spent so much time reading about Caesar that I was able to talk fairly fluently about the whole late Roman Republic in one of my interviews. Equally, when I was at university, I once got a girlfriend, in part because I spoke so passionately about ancient Rome in general and Caesar in particular that she was impressed and decided to go on a date with me. To be fair, she was a bit geeky too. I've been thinking a little though about why I liked Caesar as a teenage boy. What was it about this man that impressed me so much? Might it be that he was a fabulously successful general? By some reckonings, he fought more pitched battles than any other military commander in all history. He conquered vast swathes of land, an area even larger than modern France. He was a brilliant orator, making super speeches that swayed the fates of nations and of people. In one famous speech, he gave a passionate denunciation of the death penalty, engaging in a debate with his nemesis, Cato, about human rights. He was a super politician and rose to the very top of a crumbling political system through sheer force of will. All these things combined to make him an attractive figure to the teenage me. Now, this may well say something about the level of what would now be called toxic masculinity that I possessed as a teen. There's probably a decent level of psychological analysis that could be done about me. A teenage boy who had no contact with his father throughout those years, projecting his need for a role model on a famous, or at least infamous, historical figure. However, I prefer to think that to me, Caesar was just cool. He was a suave, sophisticated, intelligent, brave chap. And that was enough for me. Recently, though, I've been thinking a bit about Caesar and revisiting some of my old books. And I don't think that I feel quite the same way about him. This may be a result of my having grown up a little bit, but it's also quite possible that it's linked to how my values have changed. I started thinking about my values and the values of this college and how closely they fitted with ancient Rome in general and Julius Caesar in particular. Now, all the students in this school would be able to tell me what those three values are: curiosity, courage, and generosity. And undoubtedly, There was much that Caesar did that fitted directly with those values. But the world he inhabited was not one that would necessarily have recognised some of those values as at all important. Like so many young people in their 20s, Julius Caesar went on several gap years. He was fluent in several languages and travelled around Greece and Turkey. Some of these were study years where he looked to improve his mastery of oratory. All these trips, though, were undoubtedly a sign of his immense curiosity in the world around him. The world today is small. There's a McDonald's in every corner of the globe, and the iPhone works pretty much everywhere. The ancient world was not like that. Caesar would have had to engage with people who were utterly different from him, and about as close to aliens as we can imagine. Such was Caesar's curiosity that he must have been one of the most well-travelled people in his entire world. Over his lifetime, he travelled from Britain to North Africa and from Turkey to Portugal. Such curious wanderings did not come without risk. On one of his trips, probably when he was about 19 or 20, Caesar was captured by pirates. He was held hostage for 40 days, which must have been scary for a youth. His curiosity had gotten him into trouble. When the ransom was paid, Caesar gathered a military force, seized the pirate base, and captured those who had captured him. Caesar acted differently than they had, though. It was not enough to simply get his money back. He crucified every one of the pirates that he captured. The curiosity that he displayed throughout his life was a peculiarly Roman type of curiosity. Caesar undoubtedly saw himself as superior and Rome as superior. The punishment that he enacted against those who had wronged him, though, was incredibly brutal. That response was one that was praised in Rome and earned Caesar promotion. Brutality was undoubtedly seen as a good thing. Caesar was certainly brave. He fought in dozens of battles and never really lost one. In one of his most famous victories, his forces were looking like they were going to lose. One of the sources states that as his troops were close to buckling and retreating, he seized the shield from a soldier and ran ahead of his troops towards the enemy, dodging 200 spears and slingshots aimed directly at him. The whole army then rushed forward to join him and fought the entire day, meaning that Caesar won the victory. That courage, that kind of courage, is incredible. It's most likely because it mattered to the ancient Romans. They had a word which encompassed the whole ideal of courage, virtus. It meant bravery, character, self-worth. There was even a god, Virtus, who they could and did worship. Virtus mattered. Caesar's courage and virtus helped him win military glory. Military glory led to political success. Political success led in turn to more opportunities for military glory. In Caesar's case, it led to him being the sole ruler of most of the known world. However, as I've grown older, I've started to be more aware of the horrors of what that relentless pursuit of virtus and those excessive displays of courage meant. In his conquest of Gaul, Caesar enslaved about 1 million people and killed a further 1 million. Now, whilst we all know that he didn't manage to capture Asterix and his small village, he became the most powerful man in the world by murdering 1 million people. And in one of his last battles in Gaul, he cut off the hands of all those of his enemies who survived and sent them wandering around the country as a sign that Rome and Caesar should not be crossed. Early in his career, he very likely fought in an army against the slave general Spartacus. At the end of this famous uprising, the 6,000 surviving slaves were crucified along the main road leading into Rome, and they stayed there rotting for over a year. The Roman idea of courage, virtus, is very far removed from what we might see as courageous today. Caesar was generous, perhaps to a fault. Many of the men who assassinated him on the Ides of March were people who had been pardoned by him after they'd fought against him in the civil wars. He gave 300 sesterces to every Roman citizen in his will, along with his gardens, which turned into public parks. He built new marketplaces and buildings across the city. He was probably the richest man in the world at the time he was killed, and was using that wealth for the Roman people. Even that speech against the death penalty, though, wasn't generous. It was probably because he was worried that the criminals who were going to be killed, former allies of his, would drag him down with them. All Caesar's generosity can be seen as cynical. He was using it to gain favour with the people and to protect himself. This is a good early example of populism, which is something still current in politics today. Leaders like Vladimir Putin and, to an extent, Donald Trump are consciously or unconsciously modelling their behaviour on the example of Caesar. Leaders throughout history have copied the cynical generosity of Caesar to hold on to power. As I've grown older, I still admire Caesar for his curiosity and his courage. However, even within those two aspects of his character, there are those flaws, those crucifixions and mutilations, which are entirely ungenerous. Even his generosity is not generosity we today would recognise as real. It wasn't unusual for ancient Rome, but it is unusual today. I've spoken a lot about crucifixion already, but it is because of one specific crucifixion that Caesar now feels like an odd character for me to have idolised when I was younger. 70 odd years after Caesar's death, Jesus was killed by the Romans. We've already seen that crucifixion was a dreadful punishment, but it was one that was used regularly. It was a punishment reserved as an insult to those who were not Roman and who had, in fact, offended Rome. We've heard in this assembly how it was used for pirates and slaves, the scum of the Roman world, at least as the typical Roman would have viewed it. The historian Tom Holland has pointed out that the whole religion of Christianity is based around the fact that the founder of that religion was subject to the most humiliating form of execution imaginable. The cross that forms the centerpiece of so many Christian churches is the whole point of the faith. Christians believe that Jesus Christ sacrificed himself in an awful way for the sake of humanity. That is an example of generosity that blew anything beforehand out of the water and encouraged people to follow that example of generosity. That's why I struggle more with Caesar now than I did. Not because of my own Christian Catholic faith, but because I now understand that the whole world we live in, whether you're Christian or not, is one based on that Christian model. Our society is one that, irrespective of personal faith, tries to go some way towards caring for the poorer amongst us, for the suffering, for the needy. This is our understanding today of generosity, and it is one that Caesar and all his contemporaries would not have understood. They despised weakness and humiliation. Christians took those things and turned them into the centerpiece of their faith. I guess that I still love Caesar. I still think he's cool and was evidently a man with talents that would have made him stand out at any point in history. However, I think that as much as I love him, I now have far more reservations about him. By modern standards, he is a horrifying creature, a street gangster, a war criminal, and a populist dictator. Now, I'm never really that keen on judging historical figures by our standards today, at least in anything other than a slightly frivolous way. It can be an interesting intellectual exercise, though, and can also allow us to think about who we are today. Caesar, who died on this day over 2,000 years ago, would have admired two of our college values. He would have loved our focus on courage, or virtus, and curiosity. However, our most important value, and the one he almost certainly wouldn't have liked, is undoubtedly generosity. A generosity which comes from a place of love. A love which Caesar would have seen as weak, but we, our school, our community, our whole society, see as the essence of what makes us human. Now I will finish today with a prayer. Lord, teach us to be generous. Teach us to serve you as you deserve, to give and not to count the cost, to fight and not to heed the wounds, to toil and not to seek for rest, to labour and not to ask for reward, save that of knowing we do your will and follow your example of generosity. Amen. I hope that everyone has a wonderful weekend. Thank you. Goodbye.